Welcome to the High Performance Hockey Podcast. Like we did last year, this year's episode is a reflection and contemplation of 2024. You know, it's been a fantastic experience now, the second full year running a podcast. I really got involved in this for three reasons. Number one is I really wanted to learn from distinguished guests, colleagues, and friends, which is great. I thought this would be a great platform. Number two, to share that information with a broader audience. And last but not least, love the game of hockey. Wanted to leave the game in a better place. And this year was another year full of growth, both personally and professionally. So I just want to share a few highlights in a quick little podcast episode, reflection and contemplation. This was the first full year for me coaching with my younger brother, Matt. I coach my little nephew's U10 team, and it's been an unbelievable experience. To say it was a learning and growth experience for me was an understatement. You know, this is a year in the sport of ice hockey where kids are essentially moving from the cross ice game to a full ice game, which is a challenge. As we understand, obviously young kids have long-term working memory that looks like my hairline, so non-existent. And essentially, it's not how fast anymore you get there, it's being in the right spot. So being the fastest person in the wrong spot is not what we're trying to go for. So we're trying to teach game principles without having the kids feel like chess pieces. Now, let me rewind a little bit before this experience in the full ice, which rewind back to last year where my nephew played cross ice. I talked about this in detail, and this is my opinion based on my experience, but a lot of application from 20 years of hockey schools and then coaching and developing players both in the weight room and off the ice. I strongly believe that at young ages, block practice is extremely important. I do. I think right now in long-term athletic development for young kids, this sexiness is with gameplay. That's more random practice where you're learning through exploration. We call it a constraints-led approach. I get it. I like that. I'm not against that. But I always say this, in order to retain a motor skill, you first have to acquire it. And in my opinion, for young kids, that's a blocked approach. Reminder here, if I'm in a station and I'm working on passing, I'm working on passing that whole station for 3 to 5 minutes, as opposed to more of a random-based practice where you're working on forehand passes, backhand passes, and shooting. The reason I think that's critically important is when you get to that full ice game, number one, you've got the requisite skills, which leads to even more fun, and it allows you to develop and hit that full ice time frame for young kids with a better toolbox of overall skill set. Now, I'm not arguing one against the other. I still think random practice is very important. I still think small area games are important, but I'm a huge proponent of block practice. A very great book that I would recommend all coaches to read was recommended by my friend and colleague, Ben Eves. Ben Eves is a fantastic human being, had a storied hockey career. It works as a performance coach and skills coach for the Cleveland Monsters. And he recommended a book called The Coach's Guide to Teaching by Doug Lemov. And I'm going to quote a couple of these passages in this book, but again, strong recommendation. But Doug was talking about block practice. I quote, "I should note that some people argue based on the research that block practice is never optimal and should be avoided. I don't agree. I think block practice is beneficial until a skill or concept is stable in the mind of the learner. Once athletes arrive at this understanding or can execute a skill correctly, then the rationale for maximizing the memory benefits of interleaving, or in this idea, random practice, carries the day, as coaches should intentionally use this form of serial practice." So again, I come back to that concept of, you know, when you finally move, at least what I've seen from my personal experience with my nephew, is when you finally step into that full ice game and teach basic game principles, you've got to have that bedrock of skill development. I think that's critically important. Now, the other awesome experience coaching is being able to work with my brother, extremely organized professional. And it's interesting that I see what he did at the onset of the hockey season, which really enabled both the parents and the young players to hit the ground running and be organized. And again, I only learned after the fact that this was again recommended in Doug Lemoff's book, A Coach's Guide to Teaching. And what my brother did for the program was he created what he called a flight manual. The team is called the Mavericks. So that flight manual encompassed our philosophy, our principles, and again, we're talking to 9 and 10-year-olds, so we don't make it overly complicated, and a shared terminology. And it's so critical. I think it's been a huge success thus far. And I'm going to again quote Doug Lemoff in this book. There are 3 tools a club can use to build knowledge: a curriculum, a set of principles, and a list of shared terminology. So we have our shared principles. Those are important for our hockey club to have success. Okay, I'll share 2 of those with you. Decisions at the blue line. So those are important on either side, right? Decisions at the blue line. And win your races, win your battles. So those are 2 of the 5 concepts that we reinforce during our talks. We also have shared terminology. So if we're communicating on the bench, we're all speaking the same language. So our terms are short, sweet, and the kids can understand those and process those in the chaotic format of a game. So these are some really important things. And the last thing I'll say about that flight manual that I think is critically important is it gives parents an opportunity to communicate with their kids, but also to be organized as well in the development process. So it includes everybody. So this has been an awesome learning experience. Again, for me, I've been 20 years in coaching, strength and conditioning, almost 30 developing players on the ice with our hockey school, and then, skills coaching. So this has been an interesting year for me and a learning experience, to say the least, and I'm humbled by it. So let's continue to proceed here with some of the highlights. And again, I'm just picking a few of these interviews that I had this year. And there was a fantastic Rolodex of colleagues, friends, and new people that I met along the way, and new friends and colleagues that I made that were interviewed. But here are a couple highlights that I really like, and we'll piecemeal these as we go. Friend, colleague, Jeff Kubos, unbelievable human being. He's a consultant chiropractor for the Edmonton Oilers. Really value Jeff's mind and his work. He's a great human being as well. And he likes the occasional cigar like myself. Jeff, hello. But one of the quotes that I really enjoyed during our podcast interview was this: know what you see, know what you don't see, know why you don't see what you don't see, and know how to best get what you need to see. That comes from years and years of experience. I think for us, right, anytime we assess an athlete, our assessment bucket, from a movement profile standpoint, a performance or a stress standpoint, really over the years has shrunk as opposed to increased. And that, to me, is inversely related to what I consider first principles. Those first principles, one of which is biomechanics and movement. So know what it is that you're looking for. This can be done for many coaches through a standard movement screen. Perhaps it's a table. Know what you don't see. Should there be something that you're looking at? What's missing? And then know how to fix it, or maybe even better, know the limits of what you're capable of fixing. That might be tapping out. You've tried everything and you've got a great physical therapist that may be able to work with your athletes to better suit the issues that they're looking for. To me, again, when I come back to biomechanics, specifically for the sport of hockey, I want to look at what that bandwidth is. I have my biomechanical model. There's a support, there's a swing phase, and I want to look at those phases. And then I want to look at the athlete just moving naturally. For us, it's pretty simple. We just do a off ice, that is, an FMS, overhead squat, so we can see ankles, hips, and shoulders all in one pattern. Believe it or not, we don't do any other of the movement patterns in the FMS. It's just one. And the Y balance, so we're able to see how the femur moves on the acetabulum, both external rotation and internal rotation. And then we can look at over time if those numbers change. Everybody moves a little bit differently, but if there's a 5 to 10% difference in those screens year over year, it might be a cause of some program manipulation. And those manipulations may be small at best. But I think the key point here is, what's a normal bandwidth? How can I fix that? And then most importantly, can I fix that? If maybe I need to tap out and get someone else involved in this. So Jeff, thank you for your contributions. It was a fantastic hour speaking with you. And great quote, got me thinking. We had two other guests. Patrick Ward has been on our podcast several times. I've talked to Patrick about this, and one of the smartest human beings I've had the opportunity to learn from. I'm humbled every time I speak to Patrick Ward. And I also had a colleague of his and a measurement expert and physical therapist in his own right, Scott Morrison. And we talked about this concept of measurement error. This is probably, honestly and candidly, probably a subject that I've dug really deep into, this idea of measurement. I have a personal bias in this. I think everything nowadays is numbers, and relying on objective information. But at the end of the day, if those numbers are poor numbers, then we're really relying on noise. So I wanted to speak with Patrick and Scott on this idea of measurement error. And the nail hit me on the head with a quote from Scott. And I'm going to quote this from Scott. "We think that the error is contained within the device. It is not. The error is the process that you collected the data from." I'm going to repeat. The error is the process that you collected the data from. Okay, the process. If you look at academia and the process that they collect data from, so if you're looking at published research, they try to control variables. So they create an artificial environment. So they're able to better say X led to Y. Now, unless it's a controlled experiment where you've got a control and an experimental group, which very rarely happens nowadays in the exercise science literature. But what they will do is control variables, meaning time of day, nutritional status, dynamic warm-up, cues. Those are all elements in research that they try to control to better say X led to Y. So what I think is important for the applied practitioners is we can learn from that. We can learn from the research. And we call this ecological validity, meaning, can you do this in the real world? It's never going to be a perfect process, but can we do our best in the applied setting to control the controllables? Perhaps it is time of day. Perhaps it is the same individual giving the same cues. Perhaps it is the same dynamic warm-up. Perhaps it is the same amount of practice jumps before the actual testing occurs. So these are all elements. I guess the key to this for me is I have to be consistent in my data processing, or my data collection rather. I want to be as consistent as possible so I can have reliable numbers to choose from. Yes, you can do statistical testing afterwards, ICCs, coefficient of variation, and you can do that internally. But the most important thing is the consistency in the process of the data collection. That to me was a big aha moment. I know it's probably common sense, but it's something that I took for granted, and it's something that I really think about now every time we do any kind of monitoring, testing. And I get it. It's much more difficult in the research setting than it is in the applied setting, and we all have our own unique constraints, but I think it's something worth noting. Those differences and the nuances and our ability to try to be as consistent as possible. I call it the metric hamburger. There's an objective number, the buns on either side, what we choose to measure, and how we communicate the measure. Okay, that bun on analyzation and collection, really important to think about before collecting, before jumping, before polling, etc. So we know that we have as reliable of numbers as we can. So thank you very much, Patrick Ward. Thank you very much, Scott. It was a great talk. I really also enjoyed assistant coach of the Dallas Stars, Steve Spott. Had the opportunity to meet Spotter as my brother as an assistant coach for the Dallas Stars. Unbelievable human being. And I really enjoyed our talk. Super, super humble, super insightful. And I know it's probably, you might say master the obvious, but I think it's a really, really important thing, a really important concept. He was talking about teaching clips and speaking with, elite athletes, elite hockey players about watching game film. And he said that many times what I do is I get their feedback before I give it to them. So I want to know how they thought they played. And I think it's really important, especially with, the more advanced athletes, the more advanced hockey players, is that cooperative approach that we keep talking about. I think it builds buy-in. I think sometimes even if you have to, and I'm speaking out of my own experiences and not nearly the vast experiences as Spotter coaching, but when dealing with advanced players in our weight room and dealing with advanced players that train with us, I always want to get their feedback. And maybe I don't even need to say anything because they've seen it already. And I think that creates trust. I think it creates buy-in. And I think it allows the needle to move in a direction that suits both parties, the coach and the player. And I really enjoyed that little nugget of wisdom from Spotter. Thanks, Spotter. A couple more things to wrap up, and I want to keep this podcast interview short and sweet, but it's a tweet that came across that I really enjoyed. And if I could give any recommendations, I know I talked about this with Brajesh Patel in this year's 2024 series. Kevin Neal, I talked with the same with Lauren Goldenberg that we just had on our podcast, and he talked about the idea of coaching and getting your reps as a young coach. I came across a tweet a little while ago from an individual and colleague I do not know. So his name is Brandon Herring, and I love the tweet, and I'm going to quote it. If you're a young coach trying to or just getting into strength and conditioning, go find 20 to 30 13-year-olds and train them as a whole group for 6 months. Do it for free if you have to. It will be the best education you can get. You'll learn to coach, or you'll learn to find another line of work. I could not agree with that more. My strong opinion, if you want to be a good coach, you've got to get reps. I see it more and more now where we're trying to cross home plate without rounding the bases first. And in some cases, you might find out that you actually don't want to coach. Getting those reps is critical. Getting those reps enables you to find out, A, how to communicate, B, how to push the needle forward and create buy-in. In my opinion, one thing that's lacking more and more now that I've seen now 20 years in the private sector, our education really, in my opinion, should be much more apprenticeship-based model than it is a theory model. I'm going to repeat that, more apprenticeship-based than theory-based. Success leaves clues. You've got to get out there, meet people, coach. We've got a young coach right now, our last 2 interns, and I tell them this every time. I said, you're just getting out your university degrees. This is going to be the best experience because it allows you to get your hands dirty. You're going to coach. You're going to find out what works and what doesn't. You're going to learn from people, follow, copy, emulate, but learn how to deal, learn how to communicate. And what you find sometimes is that we're living in 2 different worlds, the world of academia and the world of application. Sometimes those worlds overlap. Sometimes they don't. And you're going to find out really, really quickly if that's what you want to do or not. And there's nothing wrong if you find out it's not what you want to do. But that advice to me, I couldn't agree with more. For all young coaches, go out, meet people. Drive, make phone calls, emails, but you got to get your reps in. It is a profession that is an apprenticeship based. It is a profession where we coach people, not weights. It is a profession where the perception of the program may be more important than the program itself. So these are all things we have to consider if we want to get into this field. It starts and ends with people. Get your reps. And sometimes that might be volunteering, and sometimes it may not mean. Excellent advice. Last but not least, several books that I strongly recommend. I got off on a tirade on statistics last year, so I won't bore you with the books that are non-strength and conditioning. But two of the ones actually, one I read in 2023, but I'm going to recommend it to you anyway, and the other I just recently read, and they're both by Dan Cleather. One is Force, fantastic book. It'll take you a weekend to read. So many applications in my opinion. One of your first principles is physics. He talks about physics and how it relates to training. I think if anyone's using force plates, it's a mandatory read. The idea of net impulse and how it's directly related to the change in velocity is critically important to understand. It has massive implications for how to manipulate the force time curve, increasing the peak, the rate, or the duration of force, which are all massively important qualities. So I strongly recommend that book. The other book that Dan has written, The Little Black Book of Training Wisdom, I think we overcomplicate things, and I will point my thumb at myself sometimes when I catch myself doing this. But Dan writes a pretty simple book in terms and measures of training. And one of the key takeaways from me, and I'm paraphrasing this, is really, you've got to think about how we do things as performance coaches by just looking at Hans Selye's general adaptation syndrome. It really explains a lot, right? You've got the alarm phase, the resistance phase, and the compensation phase, right? How can we manipulate that? That everything that we do in strength and conditioning or performance involves, looking at that general adaptation syndrome. It's not a perfect theory. I'm sure there's holes in it like others are, but if we look at that, how do we design programs? Okay, what's the intensity we're going to use for beginners versus advanced? How can we look at that in a frequency standpoint? If it's an advanced-based athlete, perhaps we have to tax them harder to get a response. So we get lower into that alarm phase. So there might be less training throughout the course of the week so we can recover a fair amount. That might be the opposite for a beginner. During the in-season, how do we look at that? How can we expedite in hopes of minimizing that alarm phase and getting that resistance phase and compensation phase on level playing ground through the manipulation of recovery, restoration, manual therapy, etc. So that one simple principle permeates into a lot of what we do. Now, it wasn't mentioned in this book, but the other one for me is the SAID principle, specific adaptations to impose demands. If you can master those concepts and think logically about those concepts as practitioners, I think we can get really, really far with simple means and simple training, right? Specific adaptations to impose demands. Again, comes back to first principles for me, from a physiology standpoint, okay? What adaptation are we attempting to solicit? What method are we going to use? And then finally, the means that we use it. But what is our end goal? And what are those adaptations? How do they look, right? How can we manipulate that program based on those specific adaptations? For young players, that force output umbrella might be very, very simple. For advanced athletes who've taxed their ability to load effectively and their intensity, maybe it's variability in training, right? Maybe it's different methods and modes to solicit the desired adaptation, right? So those are two, again, fundamental basic principles that I think are really important for strength coaches, whether you're a beginner in this field or you've been doing this for 20 years, that you constantly need to revisit and critically think about. So once again, everybody, this year, everyone that has taken the time to listen to episodes, I can't thank you enough. This has been a labor of love for me. I really appreciate the opportunity to interview and share a message in growing the game and educating, hopefully, the masses. One last book I wanted to mention, I was honored to ask to write a chapter in Strength Training for Hockey. Editors, good friends of mine, Kevin Neild and Brajesh Patel. Fantastic resource for hockey players. Make sure you get your copy on Amazon. So thank you very much. Looking forward to serving everybody in 2025. One day better, 1 year better. Thanks for listening.